Welcome to the Black Curriculum, the video series that answers the following question. What literature and experiences can be shared with others to better understand Black lives? Today, we remember and honor one of the most courageous civil rights leaders in American history. The Autobiography of Martin Luther King Jr., edited by Claiborne Carson. So here's how I'll break down the discussion in this video. First, I'll talk about who he was, where he was from, who his parents were, his education, his values, and I'll conclude in mentioning some key topics in President Obama's farewell speech. So allow me to set the scene. Martin Luther King Jr. was born in January 15, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia. And at this time, there was a lot of segregation going on, probably the most apparent thing that a black person can notice. In his autobiography, Dr. King mentions the influences that his mother and father had on his life. For example, his mother always reminded him that he is somebody. His father was a very frank man, assertive in his actions, and was president of the NAACP branch in Atlanta, Georgia. And another thing I want to mention about his father is that he never ever would accept the system as it was, the system of racial segregation. Up until now, I've only mentioned segregation based on the accounts of John Howard Griffin, the one who wrote Black Like Me. This autobiography captures that divisive landscape that Martin Luther King grew up in. Negro stores, Negro schools, Negro theaters. Now, it's 2017, and a lot of people champion for black-owned businesses and black-owned institutions. But the difference between now and then is the motive in which these institutions were built. Nowadays, these institutions are built solely out of pride and cultural preservation. But back then, it was out of default. It was a necessity. During his first year at Morehouse College, Dr. King read a book called On Civil Disobedience, written by Henry David Thoreau. It was in this book that Dr. King recounts an instance where Thoreau refused to pay taxes that supported a war to prompt slavery. This brave and somewhat novice idea prompted Dr. King's nonviolent resistance concept. For those of you who are more familiar with Christian doctrine, it's basically similar to the phrase, turn the other cheek, which basically is reacting nonviolently. Some years later, he met a lovely young black singer named Coretta Scott. And he knew that she was the one for her because she was dedicated to the people and obligations in her life just as much as he was. And his sister could sing. And you know her brother was in love too, because he was writing letters and poems and whatnot. She had him writing all that stuff. And at the height of his activism, he delivered what many would consider the most pivotal and heartfelt speech, the I Have a Dream speech, in Washington, D.C. on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. A speech that let not only Americans, but the rest of the world know that equality comes after solidarity. And speaking of the I Have a Dream speech, there were some skeptics concerning the whole event. And I know you all have seen the very famous image of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X smiling in a portrait. And at a time when both of their voices were very notable to the press, they would eventually meet, but only for a moment. And after reading both autobiographies, my understanding is that their political views and philosophical views is what set them apart. Now, on the one hand, you had Dr. King basically accusing Malcolm X for fueling the violent separation between whites and blacks in America, also focusing too much on the problems rather than coming up with on-the-spot solutions and alternatives in his debates. And finally, Dr. King had a pretty good sense that Malcolm X wasn't seeking solidarity, especially if he's calling all the white people devils. On the other hand, you had Malcolm X feeling that Dr. King was an Uncle Tom. Dr. King was allegedly perpetuating injustice by inviting police brutality through this nonviolent resistance. And also he felt that Dr. King was a puppet while the whole I Have a Dream speech was being orchestrated. Now, I will say that you have to be really sensitive to the time period in which Malcolm X made these accusations about Dr. King. Regardless of their views of one another, Dr. King still goes down as one of the greatest civil rights leaders in American history because he fought for a progressive change. A change that doesn't deteriorate from generation to generation, but rather a change that spreads over all ethnicities that make up the American people. I believe that his dream was for all American people to strive for solidarity. And many will say that we still have a lot of work to do with regards to race relations today. If you're like me, then you listen to how President Obama reminded us that, and I quote, "The root of democracy is solidarity." The key ingredient, I think, to Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. This basically means that we have a responsibility to uphold our American ideals and principles. I'll finish by highlighting a few topics that President Obama addressed in his farewell speech: the state of democracy, race relations, and politics. Now in his legacy, something that a lot of people expected him to talk about, he talked about reversing a Great Recession, establishing a new relationship with Cuba, and securing the right to healthcare insurance, among many other things. And I'll add another one as well, his family. I mean, Michelle Obama and their daughters will be how his legacy is passed down from generation to generation as well. Now, the state of democracy, this is when we get to the responsibility that we have to uphold as Americans. He said that a lot of how we build democracy will determine how we educate children in the future. And that's true, because if we let that slip, then America ceases to become what it is. And we still have a lot of work to do, and that leads to my next point, his next point, race relations. With regards to race relations, President Obama said that the effects of slavery and Jim Crow didn't vanish in the 1960s, i.e. when Dr. King made his I Have a Dream speech. And my last point that I mentioned from his speech, politics. He said that because of our principles, we have resisted the lure of fascism. This means that America still has this openness and progressive identity that allows us to be a very powerful country, as long as we band together. And before I end this video, I'd like to ask you, it's 2017. Do you think Dr. King's dream has come to fruition? This has been the Black Curriculum.